Yeah, it's interesting because here in the United States, the Democratic Party has really latched onto identity politics and cultural issues in order to do the majority of their campaigning. It gives them the ability to completely ignore the economic injustice that most workers are experiencing right now and have some message, right? So, of course, with Biden, there was this message of decency, which is a strange message to have when you have, this constant fear mongering about the right wing. It's like, oh, they're terrible. They're going to destroy you. They're going to destroy your life. But we need to be decent. We're going to bring back decency with all these people who are accusing you of being pedophiles, right? With no evidence whatsoever. It's the most insane message. I don't think that message was effective. I think that Donald Trump being a disaster with the pandemic is what helped elect Biden. But now we're also getting this weird pivot within congressional Democrats regarding messages of racial injustice, right? They want to now completely abandon messages regarding racial injustice. And so on one hand, you have this hyper focus on cultural issues, which they've always been incredibly shallow about. They've never actually wanted to do anything to improve the lives of various minority groups throughout the country. But they used it for a campaign tool and campaign messaging. And now I just don't know. This is more a statement than a question. I just don't know what they plan on campaigning on moving forward. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, my view of that is that this was always and inevitably going to happen. They had to find a way to put a new coat of paint on capitalism. And this is what they did. They created this kind of woke capitalism, right? Which is one that's supposed to appeal to broader layers of people by saying, well, we can have more women CEOs, we can have more CEOs from minority backgrounds, and we can have all this internal training about, unconscious racial bias and whatever within our corporate elites. But the truth of it is the fundamental injustices and inequalities that relate to minority communities, so it's Black people, Latinos, whatever, in the United States, they can't be dealt with. You can't actually come up with solutions to improve people's lives unless you tackle the economic inequalities. And so they were never going to do that. And so eventually they were always going to drop these things. It's a bit the same, right, as when we had, when just before this period, one of the big games they were playing was that they were all in favor of, feminism, and the liberal elite were going to put women leaders into these positions, and that was going to massively, just that representation was going to massively improve things for women. And now young girls will be able to look at the power structure and say, well, that could be me one day. Well, actually, the vast majority of young girls were more likely to be the kind of people who were going to be the victims of the cuts to single mothers and the welfare system in Britain, for example, who were being thrown under the bus by a female prime minister. They were more likely to be people who would have needed the domestic violence services that were being cut by a female prime minister. It was a game, it was a canard that was being played with the total complicity of the liberal media, of course, but they never are going to stick with it. You cannot deal with the fundamental injustices in society without dealing with the economic struggle. That's it. End of story. And that's also the reason why the left has staying power. Why, even though they come at us and attack us and weaken us, this next decade is not going to be one where the economy is going to magically turn around. It's not going to be one where there's going to be some great improvement in the living standards of working people. Wages are going to keep flatlining. Inequality is going to keep growing. Wealth is going to keep concentrating. And while all that is the case, we've got a shot, as defeated as we are, which is why, people need to be real about defeats, the reason why we lost, but they also need to be real about the prospects.
Well, Ronan, I don't know.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nando. My bad.
Well, I just want to say that, I don't know, man. I may personally disagree with Margaret Thatcher on a few things here or there, but she did smash the glass ceiling. So.
Oh, exactly.
Never take that away from her, no matter how hard you try.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me chime in on that as a woman. I don't know if most women feel this way yet in the United States, but for me personally, it's beyond insulting when these conversations happen, right? The conversations about representation. Because what it's essentially telling me as a woman is we're going to enable this culture of tokenism where we'll put a woman in a certain position, not based on the merits of her work or what, she's able to do, but because we want to show everyone that we're great people who are giving women an opportunity. I wouldn't want to get a job knowing that I was chosen only for my gender as opposed to, the substance that I provide for a news show, just to give an example. So I don't know. I just find it incredibly insulting. And as you perfectly pointed out, Ronan, it doesn't actually do anything to materially benefit the lives of women or materially benefit the lives of people in general, workers in general. So I think, sure, representation is great, but it needs to actually lead to something that substantively improves people's lives. But to go back to what you were saying earlier about, just the need to organize and to be real about the reality of this moment. You also discuss what needs to be done in order to win. And in an interview with Michael Brooks, you discussed how we shouldn't try to claim easy victories and how, winning takes a lot more than electoral wins. So let's take a quick look at what you had to say, and I'd like you to elaborate on it.
It is not possible to shortcut this. This attempt to kind of reverse engineer socialism by getting people elected who would just like shoot up through the ranks, win an election, and then all of a sudden be able to do it all from above was never going to happen. The truth of it was, we found out, when you're talking about the media, like this is one great example. We didn't build our own left media institutions. We didn't get our people into the media institutions, and therefore the media could destroy us. We didn't do the work of producing more effective socialist institutions and organizations on our own terms, and therefore the existing parties, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, could destroy us. We didn't do the work of rebuilding the trade union movements in a way that made them a force in society that could reshape the political terrain and put things a little bit more in our favor, and therefore capital was able to shape things in a way that eventually broke and destroyed our projects. So I think what we can say is that you have to pick up some of what's lying around if you're trying to build a political project. There's no point, as you say, in engaging in like total voluntarism, thinking just by your force of your will you can create a political project that doesn't relate to the world. No, you've got to pick up some of what's there.
Yeah, I love what you said there. Would you like to elaborate on it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, first, just God, what a giant Michael Brooks was, and
I know.
Yeah, sad, and he is missed, but a great legacy. Yeah, look, I mean, I think the last decade is one where we came from a very low base. And people should be realistic when they look back at where we were in, say, 2010 and where we are now. We had to come from a period where, like, the tide went so far out in the 90s and early 2000s with the kind of what happened, the victories of Thatcher and Reagan, particularly, and how they structured the world economy. We were off the pitch for a long time. And when the tide came back in, it just picked up whatever was left on the beach. And that meant, Bernie and Corbyn are great examples of this, people who had been, had stuck in mainstream politics, but were very much on the margins. But we didn't have kind of our own organizations, our own institutions. The trade union movements were very, very weak. And this meant that we started from a really low base. And I think that part of what happened is that we underestimated, because we didn't have a good enough institutional analysis of what was happening, we underestimated the center left. A lot of people, I mean, I would say this was particularly the case in Europe around 2014, 15, and so on. Nando will remember the Podemos experience of them kind of emerging, and the idea of a sorpaso there. They were going to take over PSOE, the main center-left party in Spain. Obviously, Syriza won in Greece in 2015, and so on. And there was this idea around at the time that we were going to overtake the center-left, that they were like basically on their last legs, extraordinarily weak. They were imposing austerity everywhere, massively unpopular. All of that is true. The problem is that, we thought just because they didn't have arguments and solutions to the crisis, that was enough to knock them off. But it wasn't. It was never going to be enough to knock them off, because the truth is that the center left had this really well-established institutional network that was able to support them, from big media networks and institutions. You look at the likes of MSNBC in the United States and the job they did on Bernie during the primary campaign. They had very important funding support and institutional support from the liberal sectors of capital, which propped them up enormously. They have this whole kind of NGO and professional consultancy network, which buttress them. In a number of instances, they have more right-wing trade union leaderships, and all of those are basically creating avenues for people of the center left to do what their project is fundamentally about, which is to get them into some positions of power, not to change society, but just like to be in positions of power, win elections and occupy power, as opposed to actually use the power to change society, to transform the economy and so on. That's what they're about. It's occupying the power. And we underestimated the resilience of the center left, and they were able then to come back and knock us over, because in the end of the day, arguments aren't enough. The policies that we had and the kind of solutions to the crisis were correct. And everything that the left has been saying, not just since 2014, 15, the emergence of Bernie and Corbyn as major figures, but all the way back to the beginning of this crisis, everything we predicted about what austerity would mean, about the kind of growth in inequality, how it would tear apart the social fabric, how it would deepen the crisis of democracy, how there would be total impunity for the financial sector and it would rise back up to be dominant in our economy again. All of what we said was correct and was true. And all of the solutions that we proposed, things like increasing the minimum wage, strengthening trade unions, the Green New Deal, all of these things were the correct solutions to the problems of the day. But it doesn't actually matter on a fundamental level. It's good to have the arguments, but they don't win it for you. What wins it for you is power, is your ability to put your ideas into practice. I think that the great line that James Connolly had, that the seat of politics is not in the brain but in the stomach. It's your ability to convince the mass of people that you have a program that's in their interest and will improve their lives, and then to be able to channel that energy through institutions by building up the trade union movement, by building up strong structures, or their party structures, activist structures, and whatever they are, that actually not only get people engaged, like turning out to one protest here or there, but keep them engaged and make them political players in the communities that they're coming from. Building up things like real alternative media institutions that have broad appeal, not just to our own communities on the left, but that can actually reach out. I mean, I think, for instance, TYT is one of the few examples of a media institution alternative one that can claim mass appeal. But we built very, very few of those over the kind of period that we're talking about.
And it's a grind. Let me just say, it is a grind, and it's difficult, and there are all sorts of issues that come up, and you just want to give up. But you're right. I mean, I just want to emphasize that, because it's not easy. But what does make me happy is to see all of these various leftist, media publication shows, starting to come up. Like, they're starting to really get the acknowledgement that they need. And Jacobin and Tribune are so incredibly important to pushing the narrative further to the left, especially in the United States. There's no question about that. But I apologize. Continue.
No, I think, look, it's a good point. We need to go further. But we've got some legacy to hold on to from these periods. It's not enough, but we now need to go further. And I think a key thing where we probably went wrong in both the Bernie and the Corbyn project towards the end is, as we got more and more under siege, we turned back towards the comfort zones of the left. Our orientation fundamentally needs to be towards the people, not towards the left, not towards speaking to our own kind of groups in society, no matter how much the views of people within them might be correct, no matter how much they might be comrades, and all of that is important. We need to think of ways to project the ideas that we have across society. And then after that, because the people, when they're given the opportunity to hear that actually things don't have to just get worse forever, and your choice doesn't have to be between some corporate Democrat who's going to sell you out slowly and some like lunatic Republican who's going to tear apart your living conditions quickly. They don't have to be the two solutions, that there is another way you can build a better future, one where your life improves. When people hear that message, they respond to it. The problem is they hear it too infrequently. And then when they do, they don't know how to actually, take it forward. They don't see that. One of the big problems of the shortcut that I talked about, I think, in that Michael Brooks video, was this idea that we were going to elect Corbyn as prime minister, or elect Bernie as president, and then that would be it, that these people would get in. They put in the good policy solutions, and then, everything would get get better and people could just go back to their lives. It's not really like that. The difficulty is if you had elected Corbyn as Prime Minister or Bernie as President, what would have happened is day one, there would have been a massive attack on their entire program by capital. And we've seen there's really good examples of this back through history. Obviously, what happened to Syriza is a great example where they came in with a very good left-wing program and they were crushed. Mitterrand in France in the 1980s is another great example of this. He came in with the Programme Commun, which was really an attempt to respond to the crisis of the 70s with a left-wing direction, and he was crushed. And it's because you have to be able actually not only to have a set of policies that you can implement and give to civil servants who, by the way, won't implement them properly unless, they feel they have to, unless you actually have the strength in society to back it up. You have to be able to fight for those policies at every stage. Against powerful interests. You have to build a movement that's big enough, and that means parties that are fundamentally aligned to the working class. That means strong trade unions that can fight in the workplace. That means activist campaigns over things like, say, for instance, tenants unions and the housing crisis. If you want to have and see real solutions to the problems of ridiculous runaway rents, well, then you're going to have to organize for them, because even if you do vote into local government or national government, some good left winger who stands up and says, I'm going to do something to cap the rents, I'm going to put rent controls in, or I'm going to build social housing or whatever. The second they try and do that, all of the aspects of the system, all of the cogs of the machine of capital are going to be turned against them and are going to try and prevent them from doing it. And the only way to keep them on side is for there to be countervailing pressure from the base, from working class people. And that's our project. And it's a much longer term one than any quick fix.
Yeah. People sometimes rag on me for focusing too much on the libs, but I just agree with you in hearing you talk about it. They really are our political opponents right now. They really are the impediment that is in the way of whatever project we're trying to build. And I look at things like in the United States, where the Democratic Party has turned toward the suburbs. They dominate now with sort of well-educated voters and things like that, and kind of completely abandoned their working class base and are bleeding working class voters. While the Republican Party is not yet a working class party by any stretch of the imagination, but is making real inroads with the working class. And this is something that is not only happening in the United States, but is happening all over Europe. And you're very well kind of versed in all of the local situations throughout Europe. So there must be something bigger going on, and I don't quite understand what it is. What is that, and what is the way forward? Because at least in the United States, it feels like we're stuck in that there is, we're not going to become Republicans. Obviously, we're not going to do that. But we can't also do a third party. So we're just kind of stuck in this kind of weird between rock and a hard place between the libs and the Republicans.
One thing to say about what you just described there, Nando, if ever anyone tells you, there isn't an underlying system, like an architecture that structures all of the economies that we live in, point out the fact that across the huge cultural differences of all of these countries in the developed world, the same phenomena crop up again and again and again. And that's because capitalism. That's because the architecture of all the societies we live in fundamentally the same. It's a great case for internationalism, but it's also a great case for naming capitalism, which is the one thing the liberals will never do. They will say the system is fundamentally good.
The right wingers do it all the time.
Yeah,
I noticed that in the United States, they say the word. The liberals just don't say the word.
Because once they do, they cross over. I think the fundamental bridge to get people across when they come from, being within the mainstream liberal opinion to being socialists is the idea the system is fundamentally good but has a few flaws, to across the bridge to say, no, the system is fundamentally wrong and needs to change. And once you get people over that bridge, well, then, the process of becoming socialists and becoming more radical and so on is largely done. That's the question. And it really is about pointing out to people how all of the different problems and flaws that they see in the society around them are connected to the same fundamental system, to the same architecture that runs the economy based on profits instead of people's needs. And once you do that and you present, as I said, a compelling picture you can project out into society, people pick up on it really quickly because it corresponds to the experience they have. They're not just having a problem at home in terms of high rents they're having a problem in their work, and they're having a problem with the council services being cut. And then they're having a problem with their kids' schools being cut back in the funding. And all of these problems are happening simultaneously. And people are like looking at them thinking, Jesus, you know, like the scale of these issues is so massive, and it seems to surround me. Why is that? And we have to say, well, the answer is the system. The answer is capitalism. This is a way in which all of these things are structured. But the question of why you know the center left is going towards the kind of more cultural sectors of society, I think does bring us back to one of the reasons we failed in the last few years. It's important people kind of get their heads around this and understand it, is that, you know, it was a really difficult task what we set ourselves to do. We could never just take over the existing center-left coalition and hope to have, you know, it implement our policies. Because if you get elected on the back of, you know, the votes of a load of extremely wealthy suburban liberals, the second you get in and you try and increase their taxation, you try and tackle the kind of industries that they work in and the power that they have, they're going to turn against you, and you won't, you know, they're not going to vote for you anymore. And then your position in government is going to be compromised, because all the other elected representatives, MPs, for instance, in Britain, who represent their fractions of capital, are going to simply start, you know, voting against you, sabotaging you, and whatever else. So we had to do something different, and that is we had to expand the political game. We had to turn a whole lot of people who were non-voters, who were turned off the political system, who were alienated. We had to turn them into people who are active participants in improving their conditions and the lives that they lived. And you can't do that just with a political party that fights in an election. People need to be able to see you and what you do day to day in their lives. The likes of, say, for instance, in Britain, the right-wing tabloids, The Sun and the Daily Mail, are present every single day in the lives of working people, because their message is kind of projected across society in a way that we aren't. And the only way to sustainably change the electoral map and to bring in people who are, you know, alienated and disenfranchised is to create institutions like fighting trade unions that are going to actually give them a sense in the workplace where they have to, you know, earn their living and sustain themselves, that things can get better. You can't just assume that we can, reach these people just by having the right policies. We needed to actually change the way in which society worked, and we couldn't do that. And I think the reason why the liberal centre is now turning towards more cultural politics, not only because, you know, there are big structural questions around globalization, where actually liberal fractions of capital are the ones that are more aligned with the dominant direction of the global economy for the last 30 or 40 years now, because the likes of, say, Donald Trump, the fractions of capital that were more favorable to him were ones that were more, you know, supportive of tariffs being in place, were more supportive of kind of, having an American state that was going to basically be captured by big corporate interests and do the job for them, but do it in a national basis. Whereas the liberals have been aligned to this kind of, you know, a globalized and financialized capitalism for quite a long time. And obviously that creates, by its nature, a more cosmopolitan section of the ruling elites, and that's part of why they're aligned that way. The other one is one of the reasons why they're really going for it now, and they're trying to change our coalitions to make us culture-based coalitions that abandon huge sections of, like, the less educated working class people and so on. They're trying to go for that because I think they know that in order to hold on to those sections of society, they would have to have policy positions that are fundamentally inconsistent with the people who fund them, with the people who are really, you know, whose interests they serve. They would need to do something different in the economy, and they would need to frame politics in a different way. That visceral stuff I mentioned earlier, like, there is nothing in the rhetoric of a Joe Biden or a Hillary Clinton that responds to the fundamental indignation of working people in America at the way in which the economy runs. They are not people who can channel anger. Liberals look at the anger of the masses of working class people and they see irrationality. This is why they hate populism so much. This is the reason why, like, they fundamentally hate the idea of populism, is because they think it's all this kind of irrational stuff born of low education and people who are not, you know, we don't understand how the system should work and the good, sensible ways in which we've run it in the past. The left has to look at that anger and channel it and say, no, We're here to change that system, to fundamentally transform it, and to give you a path to improving your lives that was not available when it was being run by either the left or the right wing of capital, either the liberals or the conservatives. We have to make clear to them that we're about something different. And that means, like, in terms of the whole attitude to politics, and as I said, the visceral nature of it, we have to have a different tone. We have to be on the side of the people against the establishment, not on the side of, like, the smart technocrats against the people who really shouldn't be in power because they're a bit mad or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, the way the Democratic Party handles or messages to voters, it's just so abundantly clear that they hate their base. I mean, if their base ever speaks up about any type of inequality, I mean, it just oozes out of every campaign ad, every debate answer. It's just so abundantly clear. But I did want to ask one question about the pandemic, because, here in the United States, there has been this culture of completely abandoning the American people. There has been no new policy or no new round of stimulus to help average Americans pay their bills, avoid eviction. And so I'm curious if there are similarities between the United States and the UK. Has Boris Johnson responded similarly to how Trump has, or has he maybe been a little better?
Well, I think it's really worthwhile to make the distinction, because the UK is the worst of all the European countries, right? So we have 50,000 people dead and, like, a really bad and catastrophic response in many ways. But still, because of the social democratic fabric that Europe managed to achieve, and fundamentally because of the power of the trade unions that they still have over the West European social democracies, there has been a better response, which is the furlough scheme, which is this idea that, yeah, there's a lot of workers left out of it, but a very substantial proportion of the workforce, and particularly if you remember the earlier stuff I was saying about the self-employed, they're largely the ones that have been left out, which is another point to which, why capital pushes self-employment so much. But employees have been able to get, for a large part of this, 80%, and then at another stage, 2/3 of their wages paid by the state for the duration of this crisis, which has created a much better safety net for working people in Britain than they have in the United States. And the only reason for that is because the trade union movements in, West European social democracies were strong enough to go to bat and fight for those policies. They began, the first countries to institute them were the Nordic states. There was Denmark and Norway, and countries that have, like, very high levels of social democracy, very strong unions. Then it began to spread through Germany and another country, and, with similar situation. Eventually it gets to Britain, and all the way through, the negotiation was with our trade union Congress, and with big unions like Unite the Union, who were, able to make those cases and able to influence government policy at a time of crisis. So it's a great message to why you want to have big and strong trade unions in society. Now, why is Britain the worst of the European examples? Not anywhere near as bad as the absolute shit show on your side of the Atlantic, but still very, very bad. And the reason is because actually the social democratic fabric has been taken apart to such a large extent since the Thatcher era that you've had the NHS, which once was this great beacon of public healthcare around the world, has been massively underfunded, has had huge amounts of outsourcing and privatization, and didn't have the capacity to deal with the scale of the crisis. You also had situations like, key workers. When you think of something like a pandemic, I'll give you an example. Cleaners in hospitals were almost all on insecure temporary contracts with very, very low pay. And so what ended up happening very quickly was they were pushed to the front line, because they're dealing with, having to clean constantly multiple times a day, the hospitals where there's a deadly pandemic. And they were pushed to the front lines in those conditions. And that resulted in a lot of cleaners, very unfortunately, getting unwell. It also resulted in a kind of, in the early stages, a failure, because a lot of cleaners were refusing to do it, and quite rightly so. And then there was, industrial action and so on. But, like, this is one of the big structural factors. Another reason is the test and trace system. I don't even know if the term test and trace has really gotten to the States yet, given how anarchic things are over there with response to the coronavirus. But one of the reasons why at least some European countries, and particularly the countries of of Eastern Asia have managed to do so well with controlling the pandemic is because they have a system which is pretty accurate of testing on a mass scale and then contact tracing, where anyone who is found to be positive, anyone who's come in contact with them in previous days is immediately told to self-isolate. In Britain, it's via an app and so on. And our test and trace system has been by far the worst in Europe. And the reason for this is because it was given to chancer private corporations and not run either by local authorities or by the NHS proper. It was handed over to Serco and Cytel, who are these like mass outsourcing companies, privatized companies who have for years been like welfare profiteers, effectively making money off the aspects of the state which should be public services. And it was given over to them. They hired a load of people who, like, you know, the stories coming out of their call centers were people with no qualification who were basically being sent in and hardly doing any calls, not understanding how the system was supposed to work. There was nowhere near enough test centers set up. People were being sent all over the country, you know, being told when they had symptoms that they were supposed to somehow travel like at the full length of the country in order to get a test, which, you know, couldn't possibly work. And all of this came down to the fact that this test and trace system was handed over to you know, actually fairly corrupt corporations and private sector. So, I mean, Britain is better than the States. But because of our experience with Thatcher, which so mirrored your experience with Reagan, it's on a scale. You know, we are closer to you than a lot of other European countries because the free market policies have made our civic infrastructure so much worse.
Well, Ronan, I don't know if you have time, but we would love for you to stay with us to answer some super chat questions and do the SALT segment with us. And Nando, did you have a final question?
No question. Just, you know, I don't know if it's Ronan's lovely Irish accent, his beautiful visage, or his, you know, unbelievable breadth of knowledge and inspiring way of communicating it, but the fans love him. People are loving them some Ronan.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's very encouraging.
Yeah.
So,
despite my dingy, dark London lockdown, I'm
part of it.
haven't reached American standards of video production yet, but we'll get there this side the Atlantic eventually, I'm sure.
We'll get there when you launch the Tribune YouTube channel.
Yeah, Tribune TV. Yeah,
exactly.
When we get our billionaire backers and finally sell out.